Right, okay, now this is something new to add a bit more sort of visual aspects to your learning during the closure. So I'm going to give this a go on a trial period, and if people prefer this over the podcasts, then just let me know. I'm going to trial it with the Year 9 lesson that I did this week on English society in 1189, looking at the feudal system. So the point of this lesson was to, number one, describe the people involved in the feudal system, look at their roles, and also in the hierarchy, and also just to look at a describe two features question on this topic. So this here is the feudal system. So I'll just quickly draw here. This whole hierarchy here is the way in which society was controlled. And we're going to look at each area to be able to say about 3 to 5 facts about each one. And then we can develop that a bit further and look at describe two features question. So if we just look on the next bit. If you imagine that we've got the school system. Now here, you've got just roughly a few roles that you would have if to run a school. So if we look at who would be at the top of this hierarchy, quite simply, you would firstly have the head teacher. So at the top of the hierarchy, at number 1, you would have the head teacher. They would control the school, they would control the budget, they would control the most important aspects of the school. But if we think, can that person do it on their own? No, because they've got this group here to deal with. And if they try to do it on their own, pupils will potentially run riot. So this is known as a hierarchy. So the head teacher, to be able to control the school, they'd need their deputy head as their number 2. This is really important, as that person will be given jobs by the head teacher to be able to run the school a bit more smoothly. Once again, though, that's only 2 people. You're going to need assistant heads to help run it further. Once again, they'll be given different roles, different responsibilities, and then they are responsible and probably have to feed back to the deputy head. They won't necessarily have to go to the head teacher because the head teacher's given the job to the deputy head. Once again, you're then going to have people like heads of department, people such as me, who have to control what the students are taught. Now that's really important, as one person oversees what the assistant heads want us to do. Chances the heads of department will have to feed back to the assistant heads. But without this group here, obviously the teachers, they feed down what the heads of department want to do. And then lastly, you've got the pupils. All of this hierarchy is to benefit you. So this is really important. Now, a few questions here. What might happen if there were no teachers? Well, it's going to be really difficult for the hierarchy at the top to run the school without teachers to pass on what the overall message and the learning. What would happen if there was only the head teacher and the pupils? Well, the pupils would run riot. And could the head teacher run a school on his or her own? Probably not. Okay, but most schools do, you do judge a school based on the hierarchy, and if you have a very good head teacher, the chances you have a very good school. This is very similar to what things were like in medieval England in 1189. So if we look at the next aspect, just changing slide. How did the feudal system work? So I'm just going to go through this very, very briefly. You don't need to copy anything into your book, but England in 1189, strange and foreign land compared to today. Now, this system here was a way to organise society based on the holding of land. This was a way of splitting the land up in England. Okay, that's the really important thing here. It was started by William the Conqueror in 1066, but this was a way of dividing land and issuing power across the population of England. So we're going to go through each one, just so we have an understanding. At the very top, you would have the King of England. Now, I'm going to add a few more annotations in here, just so you have this understanding. I'm going to add a bit of text as well, just so you totally get it. So, the king was the highest, most important individual. They would have 100% control but they would keep 20% of the land to hunt. Okay, now it's quite important you understand this person can't keep all the land themselves because there's going to be big problems otherwise. That's why the king needs help. Now we're going to go into a bit more detail about this person in a minute. The next group. Okay, so the king has to pass responsibility down to another group. And this group were known as the tenants in chief. Now this group could be made up of barons, archbishops, or bishops. They were important people. Now their job were two things. Number one, raise an army. Number two, give advice to the king. Now, they were really important individuals because without this group here, they wouldn't have potentially had an army. Now, the king found it really difficult to raise an army in England because it was very expensive. So it was down to the responsibility of these people here to be able to enforce an army. If the king needed an army in a time of protection, they would raise it, and depending on their size of their land would be the size of the army that they had. So bigger land equals bigger army. They're the tenants in chief. What about the knights? So the knights were also important. Without knights, also known as under-tenants, excuse my spelling here on the viewer, they would protect the country. How would they do it? Very simple. They would battle 40 days a year and also look after the king's castles for 2 months. Now, a lot of you might be thinking 40 days a year, that's not much. Don't forget, battles in these days may not have lasted very long. Okay. Now, the knights had to provide their own equipment. Okay, very simple. That was a way of the king to save money. And the last group, your peasants. Now, these were the lowest of the low, lowest in society, but they were the biggest group. Now, what they did was they didn't have any land. What they did, they were basically lent land by the knights, and in return, they had to work it. Very simple. Okay, now, if any of these groups didn't do what they were supposed to do, then they would have to forfeit their land. But there's a few key words that you need to understand, just so we get it. So let's start with some of the basic keywords. A vassal is someone who holds land. Very simple. A fief is an old-fashioned word for a piece of land. Now, to get a piece of land, you would have to declare homage. Now, a homage is a public promise to your lord. Why was it in public? Well, basically, if you broke your promise, you're committing treason. That's bad. Nobody wants to do that. Okay? So once you declare homage, so say, for example, these people here, the tenants in chief, they would declare homage to the king. Once they do that, they will become a vassal of a fief. Simple enough? Hopefully. Okay? Now, these are really important, but remember, if they didn't do their job, they would potentially forfeit their land. They would lose their land if they didn't do their job. The only group that couldn't lose their land were these guys here. Okay? So, that's an overview of the feudal system. And it is really important that you understand it, okay? Because this is how the king tried to control people, and it is vitally important that without this, the king would potentially have a rebellious country on his hands. Now, it all does depend on this guy at the top being strong. If the guy at the top, if the king is weak, then actually the whole system could go downhill pretty quickly. So a few more things about the king and a few more details. So the next slide, we're going to discuss the actual, the more detailed parts of each group. So bear with me one sec. So the king. Now, I've written this in first person. I'm obviously not the king of England. Top of the feudal hierarchy, most powerful person in the whole of England, 100% of the land belongs to him. But having that much land is hard and he can't rule it all. He keeps the peace and protects the country with an army. When he becomes king, it's the promised protection. He aims to be fair and show mercy to his subjects. He keeps 20%, and this land's known as the Royal Demesne. The rest of the land he gives out to tenants-in-chiefs, who become his vassals, someone who has land, as long as they declare homage to the king to prove their loyalty. The king loves this system. It helps him have an army and make sure that his land is looked after by people who he trusts. These people here. The tenants-in-chief were made up of many different groups. 50% of the land was shared out with the barons. 25% was given to the church, bishops and archbishops. They had a really important job. They made sure the king had an army. And if they didn't do that, then, well, England could get attacked. They had to swear an oath to the king, ignore the typo, nothing changes, to become a vassal. They did this in public, which means they have to keep it. God will be looking down on them. If it was treason to break the oath, and to be honest, a lot of these people, believe it or not, like being alive. They give advice to the king. They help manage the kingdom. Now, the tenants-in-chief relied on the king to use patronage to look after them. That means the king looks out for them because they're trusted. And like I said, the amount of soldiers that they had to have and provide was based on their land. The bigger the land, the bigger the army. And if they didn't raise it, they'd be fined for every soldier they didn't get, which we're going to look at later on in a bit more detail. Next group, the knights. Under tenants, they hold land, and in return, they battle for 40 days a year and protect the king's castle for 2 months. Okay, that's important. They have to pay for their own equipment, and now that was a way for the king to save money. But going back to our lesson on the medieval village, the knights were the people who controlled the villages. They helped make sure that the farming of the country was continuing. Okay, they were the ones that controlled the manorial estates. There was another group of knights, the household knights. Now they didn't hold land from the Lord. Instead, they were maintained by the Lord to protect them. Now this was a problem for the king. If a household knight was, or if a tenant-in-chief had lots of household knights, then potentially they could become a threat and become an overmighty subject, someone who would threaten the king's power. But that was very rare, especially during the reign of Richard. Knights also had to raise money just in case someone was imprisoned, and this was called a ransom. So you have to pay to get them back. And when you become a knight, you're presented with a sword and belt and struck gently on the back of the neck. If you think about when the Queen knights people today, it's very similar in those days. They then rent the land to the peasants. And that's who we're going to look at now. So the peasants. The lowest in the area of society. There's villeins who work quite regularly, cottars, serfs, and freemen. Peasants make all the food. Now, they have to perform labour service for the knights and the tenants-in-chief, so they have to work on the land during the week. Harvest time, they had to do boon work, which is extra work. Cottars work 1 day a week, and the freemen pay rent, so they do their own work, not the Lord's work. Pretty lucky guys. At a time of crisis, now, peasants might be asked to fight for their country, but they would never be asked to join the army during an actual battle. Only a crusade, which is when you were fighting to get the Holy Land back. Okay, hopefully that makes a bit of sense. That's an overview that you can look at just about all three groups on the feudal system. But the key thing to remember about the feudal system is it split the land in return for other things. That's the key thing there. So, next bit. What problems could there be? Still got that random line there. Let's get rid of that. So what problems could there be? Well, number one, if you have a bad king. If you've got a poor king, you might have a poor feudal system, which isn't ideal. Likewise, if people take advantage of their role, like the tenants-in-chief, if they have household knights, that could be problematic because they could become an overmighty subject. In regards to this, the real problems come if the king is a poor king. So, how much have you got so far? Have a look at these questions. these could be something that you look at just to be able to get an understanding on this video so far. Now, again, this won't be peer assessed. This is something that you would have done in class. This would be a question that you would do. Describe 2 features of a tenant-in-chief. Describe 2 features of the knight. If you want to practice those questions, you're more than welcome to. But as I say, this is just a trial video. They're going to be a lot more organised in the future, just to give you an idea, and just let me know if you prefer this way of teaching rather than just the podcasts.